Hello everybody, I'm Betsy from Agility with Sound and the Word Chain apps. And this is just a very brief introduction to what reading and spelling are all about and what the skills are that underlie it. So when I hear a word, let's say I hear reading, I'm here r, e, d, e, n. And when I see it, I see that same sequence of sounds. R, E, D, N. I've made a match between what I hear and what I see. And that is the essence of reading. So hear the word, see the word, make the match. It's this, reading goes this way. I see the word, R, E, D, N, and I turn that into a pronunciation, so it goes this way. And to spell that word, I have to hear those same sounds and write them down. It's the same thing in the opposite order. Hearing, seeing, making the match. Making the match is quite straightforward for most kids. For short words, 3-letter words, maybe 4-letter words, requires specific strategies when words start to get a bit longer, when there's 7, 8, 10 letters to deal with. So for kids who are barely starting to read, usually the issue is with being able to detect those sounds in a word. For the kids that get a little way down the track and then come unstuck, it's usually about the strategies for making the match. Not always, but generally. Now, hearing those sounds and words and identifying those sounds and words, it's not automatic. It's not necessarily easy. If I say from really slowly, you'll probably hear that there is no clear boundary between the f and the r and the r and the o and the o and the n, like this. F, and hearing that there are actually 4 bits to that word is not easy for many kids. And then there are other kids who don't actually detect the boundary between f and v and p and b and and e and sh and ch and other sounds that are very similar. So, but those sounds do relate to the positions that your mouth makes. So to make from, I have to go to 4 different places. I go like this, and then I slide to then I open my mouth, and then I close my lips like this. 4 different things that happen. And then what you see, which is about the phonics, but not just about the phonics. It's also about thinking of those letters or letter sequences as sounds and linking those sounds to the pronunciation of a word. So seeing that whole string of letters, r, e, d, e, n, for instance, and linking it to reading. That all has to happen. Knowing that those sounds that I hear and the sounds that I see are the same sequence of sounds in the same order. So reading is making the match one way, spelling is making the match the other way. But for kids who can go a little way in reading and then come unstuck, usually, but not always, the problem is the additional skills involved in making that match. Okay. Now, for those skills to be useful in reading and writing, they must become an instinctive, automatic way of thinking. It needs to be really effortless and eventually unconscious. It needs to happen at reading speed or faster. And because of the nature of our language, it needs to be quite flexible kind of thinking. And that applies to all words, all words. It's a complex language that we have, and it comes from multiple different strands. So we've got a strand from Old English, and a strand from Latin, and a strand from Greek, and a strand from Old French, and they tend to be spelt differently. So we have SH making the sh sound in the Old English strand, But CH makes it like machine or chalet in the French strand. And then Latin, which is half the words in the dictionary, doesn't have an SH, doesn't have a CH, doesn't have a K. So they do that in other ways. So it's quite complex. And the other thing that makes it tricky is that some of the most common words, the spelling pattern was established centuries ago when the word was pronounced quite differently, like laugh. We used to have a sound that was represented by GH, kind of a guttural sound like bark or lock, and it's kind of disappeared from English now. And some words like daughter, it's gone completely, and others like laugh, it's been reduced to a f sound. But we do know that even with words like this, a competent reader and speller will look at that word and see l, a, f. Not the usual way of doing nevertheless, that's what it is in this word. And they'll link that spelling pattern to the way that word is pronounced. GH has become one of the multiple ways of spelling the f sound. Didn't start out like that, but that's what it is now. So we get cough and tough and laugh and so on. And this is what I mean by flexible. A student comes across this word precious for the very first time, and they know this and they know this and they figure out this must be precious. That's the only word that makes sense. So therefore, this must be making the sh sound. That thinking needs to happen. That's the point we need to get to, where that thinking is automatic and instinctive. Coming back, looking at that CI and making that connection in their head. There are apparently 1,120 ways to spell the sounds of English. We can't possibly teach them all. So we need to get to the point where the kids can work that stuff out for themselves. I'm just going to show you a word that I made up, and I think you'll be able to find that you can figure it out instantly. You know that this bit is going to be E. You may not know why, but you just look at that and you know that it's going to be E. And now that you've looked at it, figured it out, you know how to spell it. And it's that kind of thinking that we need to get to. Now, this is where it's gone wrong. For so many kids, reading is something that we've invented in the last 4,000, 5,000 years. And the way we read has come from the way they invented it in the Middle East, which is writing down the sounds of the word. But because it's quite recent, and for most people in the world, we've only been had access to reading in the last few hundred years. Of course, there's people that still haven't. We haven't evolved a reading centre in our brain, and we must create one. And for good readers, there's a few changes that go in the brain, a bit of restructuring in the process of learning to read. Some kids get it right and adapt the part of the brain that matches the way the language works, and some kids simply don't. They get it wrong. And this is the best analogy I've ever been able to find. We've got some kids who are down here, standing in the pool down here, feet on the bottom, maybe pretending to splash, really not even beginning to read. We've got a lot of kids in this country who are what I call dog paddlers. Getting by, getting to the end of the pool, maybe with a bit of practice getting faster and quicker, but it's not the same as competent swimming. They're going about it in a quite different way, and almost all students who struggle are either walkers on the bottom or dog paddlers. And this is what dog paddling looks like when it comes to reading. You can probably read most of those words, but you're turning it in, the student who reads like this is turning it into a visual exercise. They're not matching what they hear to what they see at all. So here we've got sh, making the sh sound. Then we've got t, making that. And there's really only two options. It can be shoot, it could be shout. Sheet, bit more distinctive. Shirt, bit more distinctive. So what the student is doing when they're reading like this is they're looking at the beginnings of the words. They're looking at visually distinctive bits further along, like this and this. They're looking at the general shape of the word, general length of the word, and you can go a long way reading like that. That's what dog paddling looks like. But there's some things you can't do. You can't look at a word like this that is not already in your vocabulary, in your oral vocabulary, and figure out what that word's going to be. Spelling is going to be a nightmare. Some of these words you may have learnt by rote, but others, let's say this one, which is purple, could be people, but in this case it's purple. Kids that haven't got that match with the pronunciation of the word, haven't lodged it in their head properly and listened to all the sounds, are likely to spell it like this. Oops. Ooh. How am I going to do that? All. Maybe like that. Doesn't look right. I think I'll put an E on the end. And so you finish up with that sort of spelling. So there are a few characteristics of all kids that read like this. Firstly, spelling is going to be a nightmare for all of them. Secondly, figuring out words that are not already in their oral vocabulary is going to be really difficult. And it takes quite a lot of mental agility to think, is this word mouth or is it month? Is this word purple or is it people? Even if it's unconscious, that kind of thing happens in the background. And some kids are better at it than others, of course, but it does take away from their ability to comprehend their text when their focus is very much on figuring out what the words are. And when you do a brain scan of a student that is reading like this, you can see that it's completely different. This is the left-hand side of the brain. Here, oops, the pen doesn't want to work there, and that's the right-hand side of the brain. This is a student who's reading well and competently, and this is one that's struggling. And you can see that all they're doing here is reading a list of words. So it's only about decoding, it's not about comprehension. And you can see that the student who is a good reader, a competent reader, and is going on to read properly, overwhelmingly, it's happening here in the speech and language part of the brain, making that link to the pronunciation of the word. Whereas this student who is struggling, whether or not they're dyslexic, it'll be the same for both, there's next to nothing happening over here, but a great deal that's happening over here to compensate, and not even the same areas of the brain that the competent reader is using. So you can see that the kids that are struggling are going about it completely differently. Instead of making it an auditory process where I listen to sounds, match what I'm hearing to the spelling pattern of the word, they're focusing on what words look like. And it's very difficult to read like that. So these are some of the things that you'll see for the kids who are dog paddlers. Firstly, it's hard going. Kids are going to get exhausted fairly soon. You often see kids in secondary school who are expected to read, several chapters of a novel, and after a few pages, they just can't go any further. It's just too tiring. They often get put down as lazy, of course, but that's not the problem. They're just doing it in a way that is truly exhausting. You'll see many kids who have figured out this word one day, can't remember it the next. They haven't got that link to the way the word is pronounced. They'll all be poor spellers. Some may be able to comprehend easily and figure out the words at the same time. Others won't. Some will be able to comprehend quite well, but many of them, their comprehension will be compromised. And if the word, for all of them, if the word is not in their oral vocabulary, they haven't got the skills required to figure it out. And of course, many of them don't like reading. Why would you, if it's primarily an exercise in figuring out words? So I'm just going to give you an example from 2 children that I've worked with. This student, I asked her to spell crushed, and she analysed the word sounds, putting A for the us sound, as many struggling readers do, and hearing t at the end of this word and writing that down. But then she did something really interesting. She looked at this and she said, "That's not right, is it?" I said, "No, do you want to change it?" So she said, "Okay." And remember, seconds ago, she had sounded out SH, making the sh sound. But now she looked at it and she said, "Well, you don't get HT, it's supposed to be TH." So she changed it to this. She said, "It's still not right. I don't think that S is supposed to be in there." So she changed it to this. And then she was happy. And you can see that she's got this cr that belongs to cry and cream and dozens and dozens, hundreds of words. And she's got this F, which she sees every day probably in the word maths. It looks right. So her thinking here was trying to think in the sounds, but her thinking here switched to the other side of the brain, to her visual side of the brain. No connection between how she spells and how she reads. Another example, this student was actually in the same class, so this is not uncommon. They were both year 5 students. I asked this child to spell some words, and one of them was chap. Down it went C-H-A-P. Easy peasy, she knows chap. Or does she? Because a few minutes later in the decoding test, which is just reading a list of words, she came across this word. And she said, I think it's cat, but there's something wrong with it. So she was searching her visual memory for a word that she knew that looked like that. And the nearest she could come up with cat. She had no way to take that that she knew the phonics, she knew how to spell it. She had no way to link it to the way she read. And that's not uncommon. So what needs to happen? Well, just as a dog paddler needs to be taken to the side of the pool and taught, I'm not a swimming coach, but I imagine this is what happens, how to put their face in the water, how to turn their head and breathe, how to keep their body straight, and so on. So must the struggling reader be taught the skills of competent decoding and spelling before applying them to reading and writing. More and more dog paddling or more and more reading badly will not help. They may get a bit better, but that is not the same as becoming a proficient reader. So for those kids that think of words as the same as speech, only in a different form, look at a word like read and see read, exactly the same as I hear read, then what they know about speech is their template for remembering all words to read and spell, all words, even words like laugh. And we know that competent readers and writers use that speech and language area of the brain to decode and spell, and only those areas. Other areas of comprehension, of course, but that's the decoding and spelling part of the brain there. And struggling readers and spellers do not and cannot yet think like this. So we go back to this. We've got to change a student who is thinking like this, down here, into one that thinks like this. And more practice at reading like this will not help. It's actually taking them out and teaching those skills, how to hear the sounds, how to link them to what you see, how to make the match. Now, all learning is discovering what a student can do, what they already know, and building on that base. And that doesn't matter whether it's how to fly an aeroplane or how to do maths or play a guitar. It's all the same. And all learning needs to be explicit and systematic, so that nothing gets left out, and in a way that the student understands exactly how they're supposed to think. And it needs to be sequential and cumulative, building on what they already know and what they've learned. And that goes for both those skills and the phonics knowledge. It needs to be challenging, because if the student isn't actually thinking, they're probably not doing much learning. It needs to be age appropriate, or they simply will not want to do it. And it needs to reach that proficiency where it's automatic and instinctive, and effortless and flexible and so on. Takes many, many hours of dedicated practice, and it needs to be practice that the student wants to do. And if they see themselves making progress, if they see themselves as a successful learner rather than a failure, they will want to do it. I'm just going to briefly talk about dyslexia, because there's a lot of confusion about what it actually means. Dyslexia is a specific condition. It's a specific and ongoing difficulty with processing the sounds of speech, putting read together to make read, or changing the e in read into an I to get rid, that sort of stuff. It's a specific difficulty with that playing around with the sounds of speech and that is necessary to make the link between spoken and written words. Now, all kids, it's not a natural thing to do. So all kids who have never attempted to do that will struggle, at least in the beginning. But that doesn't mean they are dyslexic. The essence of dyslexic is this word, ongoing. So even with lots of practice, it still is quite tricky. And it's not terribly common. The international research suggests that it's about 3 to 4% of all children, 1 in every classroom on average. And it's also a spectrum. Some kids will have a great deal of difficulty. For some, it'll be little. But to be classed as dyslexic, it needs to be sufficient to interfere with their learning to read, and it means that they will not be making the same progress at the same rate as other kids. But it's exactly the same process. They just need exactly the same process, just with a lot more practice for those kids. So the characteristic of a dyslexic kid is that they will be making slower progress than their peers, depending on how severe their struggle is. But they will all improve. Even if some are never quite as fluent as their more proficient peers. But I've never struck a kid who can't be taught to read at all. A kid who can talk and speak normally will be able to learn to read. It will just take a lot of practice of those underpinning skills for some kids. Working memory difficulties, that's another one that comes in quite a bit. Working memory is the ability to hold one thought in your head and do something with it at the same time, like say numbers backwards, or multiply 5 times 13, 5 3s are 15, carry the 1, hold that 1 in your head, hold that 5 in your head while you do the next operation. That's what working memory is. And in reading, it's about figuring out the words at the same time as you're comprehending. If that's an unconscious process, it doesn't interfere with comprehension, but also putting together multiple sounds and multiple and multi-syllable words. But there are strategies to overcome that as well. So that's it. Of course, there's other factors, oral language and all sorts that impinge. But every child can be taught to read. Okay, so agility with sound has 5 main aims. building confidence and engagement. And for older kids, that's absolutely crucial, because so many have been turned off, believe they can't do it, believe it's because they're stupid, believe it's useless, even trying. And building that sense that I can do that stuff is the very first step. Then building those skills, hearing the sounds of words, matching them to the letters, making the match for longer words. Those skills, building them systematically in an age-appropriate way with the many hours of practice that so many kids need. Then applying those skills to the process of reading and the process of writing. And at the same time, abandoning those dog paddling visual ways of thinking. And that's really all it is to it. So they need lots of practice with the skills, appropriate skills, and then applying that to decodable readers and to writing. Thank you. I hope that was helpful.